Evidence for color on marble sculpture from the Wilcox Classical Museum. The Mary Grant Gallery of the Wilcox Museum is full of plaster casts of ancient Greek and Roman sculptures. The casts are white, and they are painted white, in fact. The museum, like lots and lots of museums, has never attempted to communicate any idea about the original painted coloring of any of the sculptures that our casts represent. Take, for instance, the Parthenon frieze. The white plaster slabs of the Parthenon frieze give the impression, a false impression, that the originals were also white, when in fact we know that they were brightly painted. Nearly all of the originals on which our casts are made show very few traces of their original painted decoration. Take, for instance, the Apollo Belvedere in the Vatican Museum in Rome. Here is a photograph of the original. There are no traces of original painted coloring on this statue. Here is another example from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. This, we could say, is a typical classical statue in a museum gallery with no surviving traces of color. This is a statue of the god Hercules. But even if traces of color had once survived, they are long gone now, also because this sculpture has been cleaned again and again by museum staff and conservators. In fact, one of the main reasons that color does not survive, as we learned from our reading this week, is because the traces of color are often cleaned off. They are cleaned off by excavators. They are cleaned off sometimes by conservators or museum staff members. So it's not surprising that traces of color hardly survive on any ancient sculptures in museums today. Now we turn to some interesting evidence for ancient polychromy from the Wilcox collection. The Wilcox collection has about 25 fragments of marble sculpture and marble architectural elements from antiquity. We have maybe 3 pieces, like this one, with surviving traces of pigment on them. This is the so-called Wilcox hand. It is currently not on display. Someday, I hope it will be on display because of what you see here. The red pigment on this fragment of sculpture is quite extraordinary. This is a hand holding on to a jar or a vessel of some sort. And there are traces of red pigment all over this fragment, but particularly around the inside of the hand and under the bottom lip of the jar or the vase that the hand is holding. Here are some other photographs of the hand from different views. The upper left is a view looking up at the bottom of the sculpture, showing the bottom of the vessel and the bottom of the hand. The lower right view shows the side of the hand, showing the inside of the hand, and the left side of the vessel. When colors survive on sculptures, often that color is red, and this is very interesting. Why is that the case? Well, as it turns out, red was often applied to the base or applied as the first layer of color on an ancient sculpture. And then other colors were added on top of the red, with the thinking that the red underneath would make the outer final color look better or richer. So, not surprisingly, red is sometimes about the only color that survives, if any color survives at all. In this case, it appears as if the color red has run from one surface to another, or from one part of the sculpture to another. Most likely, the jar was the surface that the red was originally on, and that because of exposure, or perhaps exposure to water or moisture, that red pigment has run onto parts of the open hand. We have not yet had the red pigment analyzed on this piece, but most likely it is red ochre, which is a naturally occurring mineral. Red could be made easily from iron oxide found in ancient clay. It could also be made from the easily mined substance red ochre. Red ochre and yellow ochre were two of the most common and least expensive ancient pigments. Now we see a top view of this hand in the jar, and this makes it very clear that the vessel held in the hand had a spout on the front. That spout is broken off at the top. Here it's also very clear that this is the right hand of the statue that this comes from. Let's spend a few minutes talking about reconstruction of this hand and think about what kinds of sculptures this hand might have come from. Here is a 3/4 height statue of the god Dionysus from the area around ancient Pompeii, now in the Naples Museum. Notice that Dionysus is holding a cup in his right hand. So it's possible that our right hand is holding something like this. And now we're going to look at another example involving Dionysus again. This is a relief sculpture showing a statue of Dionysus on a pedestal at the far left, and then 4 cult followers. This is a relief from the Roman city of Herculaneum, located not far from Pompeii, and it dates to the 1st century BC. Notice that the cult statue of Dionysus is holding a cup in his right hand. In this case, it's pretty clear that the cup is a drinking cup. It's a cup for drinking wine. Dionysus was the god associated most with wine, also with the theater. Now, let's compare the Wilcox hand to this hand from the relief. notice they're very similar to one another. They're similar in the sense that the hand in both cases is holding the jar or the cup or the vessel, just to be neutral, in a very, very similar way. Notice how the small finger is extended underneath in both cases. So that's an interesting parallel that might help us conclude that our hand comes from a similar statue, perhaps even a statue of Dionysus. There are other possibilities, though. Here we have a sculpture of Aphrodite from the Torlonia collection in Rome. Notice what Aphrodite is holding in her right hand, a small jar, probably a perfume jar. Now, our jar or vessel, whatever it is, we're not sure, is different than this. So I think we can conclude that our sculpture is probably not a sculpture of Aphrodite. But there are some similarities between the two vessels, the one that our Wilcox hand holds and the one that Aphrodite is holding here. The major difference, however, is that the top of our vessel shows that it had a pouring spout at the front. And in this case, the little jar that Aphrodite is holding did not have a pouring spout. That thing on the top of the jar is probably simply a lid. So we're still looking for the best parallel to help us identify what kind of sculpture our hand comes from. Moving on to the plaster casts in the Wilcox Museum showing the busts of the Roman imperial rulers. Of course, all of these busts are bright white, when in fact we can be 99% sure that the originals that these casts come from were all brightly painted. So what can we do about this in the future? Is there a way in a future exhibit at the museum where we could communicate ideas about the original coloring of some of our sculptures our casts are based on? 2 years ago, students in my Roman art and archaeology class conducted some experiments to address this question. In this example, one of my students made a color reconstruction of what this bust of Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius might have originally looked like. Here we see the color reconstruction that our students Aaron Fugate and Kathleen Gepford made in fall 2018. In this case, the original sculpture shows very few traces of original paint. There are just a few tiny traces of reddish-brown pigment in the hair of this sculpture. This reconstruction suggests that all of the surfaces of the original statue were originally painted, even the skin. So the hair, the beard, the lips, the eyes, the eyebrows, eyelashes, the crown that Marcus Aurelius is wearing, and of course, his clothing. We cannot be sure if this reconstruction is accurate, but we can be confident that this bust of Marcus Aurelius was originally painted and that it looked probably something like this. In our final example, back to the Parthenon frieze, here we see a panel from the cavalry frieze. And what I've done here is I have simply made a colored pencil rendering of an option for what this original panel originally looked like. And I've simply overlaid the drawing in Photoshop, and then I created this multimedia presentation. So in this case, we are very sure that the background of the Parthenon frieze was blue, because there are traces of blue on the actual panels of the frieze. We can be pretty sure that the horses were painted in contrasting colors, but unfortunately we don't know what the original colors consisted of. We can also be sure that the clothing of the men riding the horses was brightly painted, but then again, the traces of paint don't survive, so we can't be sure about which colors were used. One big question about the Parthenon frieze involves the use of shading in the painting. As we learned in our reading for this week, there is limited evidence for the use of paint to depict depth or highlights, shade and shadow, things that we take for granted in modern painting. There is some evidence for that from especially the bust of Roman Emperor Caligula that we read about for this week. There is a little evidence also from the sarcophagus known as the Alexander sarcophagus. But this is one of the biggest questions left unanswered. We know that ancient sculptures were painted, but we're not sure if the paint was applied in a monochromatic way or if the paint was applied in more sophisticated ways using shading. Thank you.